Welcome to Living Wealthy Radio with your host, Teresa-Kuhn.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Living Wealthy Radio, heard every Sunday at noon here on Talk Radio, 1370 AM, streaming live at talk1370.com. I'm Teresa-Kuhn, helping you live wealthier. Resources are available for you at livingwealthyradio.com. Do you ever find that your memory seems a bit fuzzy or that you forgot things that happened just yesterday? Do you ever feel like your mood swings are unbearable? Are you happy one moment, angry the next for no reason at all? Do you feel tired, lethargic, or in pain daily? If you could change the way you feel, protect your brain, improve your mood just by changing the way you eat, would you? Well, our guest today is Dr. David Perlmutter, and he, along with many other scientists across the globe, have found that the consumption of carbohydrates, especially sugar and gluten-containing carbs, such as wheat, has a direct relationship with conditions such as heart disease, chronic inflammation, brain disorders, even mental disorders like bipolar and clinical depression, dementia, and even Alzheimer's. Doctor, welcome to our show today.
Teresa, I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Why did you first decide to research how what we eat affects the way our brains function?
The way you asked that question, I have to take pause because, my goodness, why would it not? We've come to think that we should just be able to live our lives come what may, and then once we start to forgetting why we walk into a room, why we expect that there's going to be some magic pill available for us that we can take and make everything all better. But
well, you are a neurologist, right? You're trained under the traditional medical convention.
And therein lies the reason I wrote this book, because I found after practicing neurology for a number of years, well into my first 15 years of practicing neurology, I realized that just isn't good enough, that we know now, and the literature is certainly replete with references indicating that our lifestyle choices have a profound effect on every system in our bodies, like our heart, like our muscles and bones and immune system, and the brain as well. And what was so challenging to me is that no one was willing to talk about it, despite the fact that we had this incredible body of wonderfully researched publication that was out there in the ether, and again, it was being ignored.
So who published all this information? Certainly not the conventional medical.
These publications have been appearing in the journal Neurology, Archives of Neurology, New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association for years, indicating that some simple premises like mild elevation of blood sugar can have a dramatic and detrimental effect on the function of the brain. I mean, just recently in the New England Journal of Medicine, that's probably arguably the most prestigious medical journal on the planet, was a fascinating report showing us that even having blood sugars of like 105 to 110 that most doctors might give you a pat on the back and say, hey, don't worry about it. These levels are already associated with a dramatic increased risk for developing dementia, and that is a disease for which there is no treatment. So that said, it was my mission to get this information out to the world, and I think the fact that people have been so desperate to get this information may well represent why this book, Grain Brain, has been so popular.
Popular among many, but you do have your critics.
I do. That's a good thing because it's conjecture that motivates progress. And, I've come out absolutely challenging the status quo in terms of what we should be eating. The status quo is we should all be on a low-fat, high-carb diet, and, that's the best thing for your brain and for your heart and everything else. And the bottom line is not only is it the most ridiculous approach to human nutrition ever, but it's not supported, as you and I have this conversation, by the peer-reviewed medical literature. So again, doctors to this day continue to parrot, you should be low-fat because that's the diet recommended by the American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association. There's no longer any scientific data to support the notion of limiting fats from your diet as being necessarily a good thing to do. It's absolutely the wrong thing to do for heart health, immune health, and brain health.
So why do you think the American Diabetic Association still promotes that?
Well, I think old habits die hard, and I also think that people tend to be down on what they're not up on. But I'll say, perhaps from a cynical perspective, that you should go to their website and understand who their sponsors are. Mm-hmm. And you'll see that there's a great interest, subtle, but certainly comes out in their recommendations on the part of various industry giants to make sure that we continue to pound our bodies with carbohydrates, which are detrimental for the brain and the heart and increase risk for diabetes, for that matter.
So follow the money.
What can I say? I mean, it does sound a bit cynical, but it's reality, because even, as I mentioned, in terms of heart disease, our most well-respected journals dating back to 2007, 2008 have demonstrated that a higher good-fat diet with restriction of carbohydrates is the most health-promoting. And again, when I say a high-fat diet, I'm not talking about having pork rinds and bacon all day long. I'm talking about really good, natural, brain-healthy, heart-healthy fats like olive oil, avocado, nuts, seeds. If you choose to eat beef, it should be grass-fed beef, not the typical meat that's offered in the grocery store, and wild fish as opposed to the farm-raised that are so common and available in restaurants and grocery stores.
So you're not talking about the kind of diets, and for the moment, the name escapes me, but that famous diet for so long by a cardiologist, that the Atkins diet.
Yes, Dr. Atkins was absolutely on to something. As a matter of fact, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, there was a head-to-head comparison of the Atkins diet, the traditional kind of high-fat American diet, the zone diet, and then a very low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet that's called, that many people associate with Dr. Dean Ornish.
Yes.
And actually that was really quite an interesting comparison. It was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Again, that's the AMA, in March of 2007, and across the board, the higher fat diet, which is the Atkins diet, beat out all the other diets in terms of all the parameters that are important for heart disease risk, and was associated with the most weight loss, the best blood sugar control, and, in terms of their metabolism, was associated with the most positive change. That was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's called the A to Z trial. But the low-fat hypothesis has really become kind of a low-fat religion, where we see in the stores to this day low-fat Oreo cookies, low-fat this and that, and that's supposed to be some kind of moniker for being healthful, and in reality that's not true. What I'm suggesting to you today is that the idea of eating a high-fat, low-carb diet is a brand-new, revolutionary recommendation, and it's only been what we've eaten for about 2 million years, so it's been around the block, you know what I mean?
Right. So do you subscribe to the whole paleo?
I think the paleo diet is a very, very effective diet. But, the issue here is, again, paleo diet is basically a diet that's high-fat, low-carb. What did our Paleolithic ancestors have for carbohydrates? They had none. Even in Neolithic times, in our recent history, we didn't have carbs. We didn't have bread. We didn't have grains. We didn't have fruit. There might be an occasional blueberry in the late summer, early fall. But by and large, we've always been on a high-fat, low-carb diet with animal protein. Now, again, to make a very important point, that is that the animal protein that we get today, that's used in the studies that come out talking negatively about eating animal protein, is really dangerous food. This grain-fed, GMO, grain-fed, hormone-injected, antibiotic-treated foods that pass as somehow being healthful are really dangerous. So what I'm suggesting is you've got to be quite selective in your food choices. To say, let's assess whether a person eats meat or not and then determine what the health risks are, really isn't fair. Comparing, grass-fed beef to the typical commercial beef that goes into fast foods, for example.
So So the whole Atkins diet, high fat, low carb or no carb, really that diet was about eating any meat whatsoever.
That's right. And I think that there are some criticisms towards that notion. Again, it's not like I'm advocating pork rinds and bacon to be eating, as a good food choice throughout the day. The point is that the types of meat that you eat and the sources of fat are very important. If you want to go on a high-fat diet, and that means having prepared foods with trans fats, hydrogenated, damaged fats, then by all means, that's going to increase your risk for some very dangerous things down the line. Cardiovascular risk, probably brain issues, and certainly immune problems, which translate into risk for cancer. So that said, you've got to be really selective. Is it challenging? It is to some degree. But I think that, the success of GrainBrain, the success of this book has been because we've made this user-friendly. We've given people what they need to know when they go to a restaurant, when they go to their doctor's office, when they go to the grocery store. What are the right questions to ask and what they should be looking for?
So going back, to our early times, it has been, well, let me go forward for a moment. In the last 100+ years is when the whole industrial age with food really started to, I guess, poison our food supply or change our food supply and change the way we eat, right?
Oh, no question.
And only in the last 100 years have we seen illnesses and diseases that we never saw.
Well, that's true. I mean, there's this notion that, oh my gosh, our life expectancy now is in the upper 70s. My goodness, our food sources must be just really wonderful because, our ancestors had a life expectancy that was really low. It was in, even around the turn of the last century, it was 48. So obviously we're doing something right. Well, no, that's not what that means. Because average means you factor in childhood deaths. And that is that there are large, the number of children that die early on in life has come down dramatically. So that's it. In olden times, before we had really good emergency medicine and perinatal care, children would die, with a much higher frequency, and that would bring the average down. And we would die of infectious diseases back then as well that have been wonderfully eradicated. But that said, for the first time in history of humans on this planet, the life expectancy of our children is predicted to be less than ours. That is a scary proposition. Our children are genetically the same as we are, obviously, but what's happening from what's called an epigenetic perspective, in other words, food and environmental issues, is having a huge effect, taking a very great toll in compromising their lifespan, for crying out loud. So this is really very, very important information. We actually influence the expression of our genome, of our DNA, based upon the foods that we choose to consume. And our genome is basically the same as it's been for the past 40, 50, 70,000 years. It hasn't changed. But now it's getting these really perverse signals based upon the foods that we're consuming.
So the title of your book is Grain-Brain, but the grains and the carbs affect every part of your body.
That's right. And, and me being a neurologist, of course, I'm focused on the notion that we have 5.4 million Americans suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and no one's talking about it. I was amazed in the news 2 weeks ago in the New York Times was an announcement that there's this collaborative effort donating about $300 million to find a cure for Alzheimer's. Well, I don't think we need to do that. I don't think we should endeavor right now to spend a third of $1 billion to find a cure for Alzheimer's disease. What we need to do is let the population know that this disease, costing us $200 billion a year, is by and large preventable. It's preventable based upon lifestyle choices. Just last August 2013, New England Journal of Medicine was a very compelling study published demonstrating that even with a blood sugar of 105 and 110, where most doctors are going to give you a pat on the shoulder and say everything's fine, don't worry about it, those levels of very mild blood sugar elevations translated dramatically into increased risk for the very thing we're talking about, for dementia. And yet, that didn't make the news. No one talked about it. It was published in, again, one of our most well-respected peer-reviewed journals.
Is dementia and Alzheimer's epidemic all over the world, or is it just here in the United States?
Well, it's far more epidemic, oddly enough, in Western countries, in countries that have higher levels, oddly enough, of hygiene. Who knew? Interesting story. But it's much, much more prevalent and increasing much more rapidly in cultures that have adopted our way of eating.
So why is that? Because you would think that the poorer countries don't have access to meats like we do.
Well, that's a very good question, but they're not as yet, but it's shifting very rapidly. They're not as yet so fixated, third world countries, on loading themselves up with carbohydrates. And, beyond that, the hygiene part of the story is really very, very interesting, and that is in those countries where they have the most parasites in their guts, the highest level of parasites correlating to very poor hygiene, their risk of Alzheimer's is really, really low. So, it's a bigger picture than just nutrition. It's all about taking antibiotics to alter the microbiome, the bacteria in the gut. Everybody's talking about that now in terms of immunology and inflammation and Alzheimer's and heart disease and diabetes. What is the role of the gut bacteria? Who knew? And it turns out it's strongly related to things like Alzheimer's. So it's a big call to avoid antibiotic exposure, even in terms of the foods that we eat.
So the parasites, what does that have to do? Is that part of the whole?
The parasites in and of themselves are not the issue, but they were used in a recent study as just a marker in terms of hygiene.
Okay.
The biggest player of all has to do with carbohydrates and raising blood sugar. These are studies that go back to 2008, 2010, and when you raise blood sugar by consuming a diet that's high in carbs, what happens is you change your proteins. It's called glycation, meaning sugar binds to protein. And when that happens, when you glycate your proteins, you turn on inflammation and the action of chemicals called free radicals. These are the cornerstones of Alzheimer's disease. And this isn't news. It's been talked about for years. In 2012, in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, January of 2012, the Mayo Clinic, the well-respected Mayo Clinic, published a report indicating that those individuals favoring a high-fat diet have a 44% reduction in risk for becoming demented compared to those favoring the standard high-carb American diet, whose risk comparatively is increased by close to 90%. Now, this is a disease for which there is no treatment, and our most well-respected journals are telling us what the clues are here. Dr. Deborah Barnes of University of California, San Francisco, recently published in the journal Lancet Neurology, indicating that 54% of Alzheimer's patients in the United States didn't have to get that disease had they paid attention to certain modifiable lifestyle factors. So, what did I do in GrainBrain? I wrote about it, I put it all in one place, and I made it user-friendly. So people are now learning this stuff because they're not going to get it by watching the evening news, and there's certainly not going to be any advertisements telling people they should cut back on carbs and eat more fat. You'll see advertisements for this or that medication, but there is no drug to treat that problem.
There's so many industries. If you're going to follow the money, and I don't mind going to the skeptical, cynical part because, it's just the reality. And, I went to law school, so, I've got that legal training. But you've got so many industries that are so well-funded by the dementia and the Alzheimer's. You've got the food, you've got the pharmaceuticals, you've got the hospitals, you've got the insurance. There's so much money behind treatment and not prevention.
Well, that's right. That is basically, you said it. This is how medicine is practiced today. There is no emphasis on prevention whatsoever, only on hoping for a magic pill. With the huge Washington healthcare debate about this part of the program and that part of the program, I think it's all well and good, but you have to understand this is not a healthcare initiative. This has nothing to do with health. It has only to do with illness, what happens to you when you become sick. And I would contend that is ridiculous. Not that it's not wonderful to have these things available, but let's keep people healthy in the first place. It's cost effective. It's emotionally the right thing to do. It's morally the right thing to do. This isn't news. The Yellow Emperor in the 4th century B.C. said that maintaining order rather than fixing disorder is the ultimate principle of wisdom. To cure a disease after it has manifest is like digging a well when one feels thirsty or forging weapons when the war has already begun. So my point is, let's keep people healthy. Let's tell them what is the current science focused on in terms of maintaining health, and what can you do to change your lifestyle so that you don't suddenly walk into a room and forget why.
So if somebody has dementia or has, symptoms of dementia, is it reversible?
It can be, yes, ma'am. I will tell you, first of all, that many, I'm a practicing neurologist. As a matter of fact, I just left my office to do this interview with you today, seeing dementia patients beforehand. And I have to admit, a lot of the patients come in with issues of memory, etc., and frequently it is because of their medications that they're taking. Taking too many, having an adverse reaction to one or more of them, and that's really the first place we look. But even Alzheimer's disease in some patients can be improved by changing the diet. And that is, it's a heck of a statement, but it's something that we see very frequently. It's something that I wrote about in grainbrain. And it's something I think that people need to understand, because I, like many of your listeners, am the child of an Alzheimer's patient. So I visited with my retired brain surgeon father this morning with Alzheimer's disease.
He was a brain surgeon?
Yeah, Leahy Clinic, wonderfully trained individual. So I get this. And, when I'm walking down the hallway with the family members after I've evaluated mom or dad, and they say to me, what can I do so I don't end up like that? I sit them down and I give them pretty much the information that you and I are sharing right now. I hand them a copy of grainbrain, and I say, you've got to do this. You've got to start right now, because that situation doesn't have to be your destiny. You can rewrite your destiny. You can rewrite your book of life by paying attention to this. And again, as I said before, this isn't a revolutionary shift in human nutrition. It is absolutely getting back to what we've eaten for 99.9% of our time on this planet. The aberration is this new diet that focuses on low fat and high carbs. And there is no further literature these days up to date that is supportive of that as being healthful at all. It's completely wrong.
I remember, 20 years ago, there was a girl who wrote a book about, fat causing fat, right? You want to go low fat because high fat, of course, is going to give you fat. And,
well, it doesn't work that way.
Of course not.
When you signal your body with carbohydrates, it causes your pancreas to secrete an enzyme called insulin, actually a hormone. And insulin's job is to make and store fat.
Yes.
So
exactly what you don't want when you're fat and trying to lose weight.
Yes. If you want to lose weight, eat fat. You won't insulin signal, and you'll lose weight. Eat fat, get thin.
What a concept.
Who knew that was why South Beach worked? That's why Gary Taubes' books have been so effective. That's why the Atkins-diet worked. Because when you eat fat, it tells your body basically the hunting is good. We don't need to store calories.
We don't need to store calories. Bingo. That's it, right? So we're going to take a quick break. Dementia, Alzheimer's. If you've seen a loved one go through the stages of these diseases, you know that it can be devastating for you, for them. If you could eat to improve your brain health, would you want to know what the best foods are to eat? Stay tuned, and we'll be talking to Dr. Perlmutter about how to protect our brains from diseases such as these. We'll be right back. Teresa Kuhn with Living Wealthy Radio.
Living Wealthy Radio. Visit Teresa's team online at livingwealthyradio.com, 1-800-382-0830 now. Call 1-800-382-0830.
Welcome back, Austin, to Living Wealthy Radio with Teresa Kuhn.
You eat for energy, to lose weight, to feel your best. What about eating to protect your brain? Did you know that there are foods that the FDA recommends eating sparingly that can actually help improve your brain health? Dr. Perlmutter is our guest today, and he says we should be eating more fat, less carbohydrates to help our brains function better. So, Doctor, this goes against, the conventional wisdom.
It goes against the grain. I know you're dying to say it.
It goes against the grain. However, before we went on break, you mentioned something about the fat and how that so simply you described why healthy fats help you stay thin and help your brain. Can you repeat that?
Well, again, it has everything to do with what we call insulin signaling. Insulin is the hormone in your body that tells you basically winter is coming. And what I mean by that is, in our hunter-gatherer days, the time when we would find carbs and sugar would be when the fruit ripened at the end of the summer, early fall. Winter's coming, and that's why we have a sweet tooth. We would eat those foods, the berries we might find on the ground, and it would signal the body to make insulin, to deal with the carbohydrates, but as an added benefit, it would signal your body to make and store fat so that we made it through the winter. The problem is, these days, the winter never comes, in other words, the time of food scarcity, and we're always pounding our bodies with that mechanism, signaling our bodies to make and store fat by eating carbohydrates. But that's where the mechanism came from. It actually, if it wasn't for our sweet tooth, we wouldn't be here today. But consuming fat basically, again, tells your body that food is abundant, that there's no need to store fat because you've got plenty, the hunting is good. And that's why a diet that's primarily deriving its calories from fat is the best diet to help you lose weight. And that's, again, behind the success of the various diets like the Atkins-diet and South Beach diet. These are high-fat, low-carb diets. If you want to lose weight, eat more fat. But you've got to cut the carbs.
So back in our ancestors, right, before the industrialization of food, they didn't have access to all the food groups that we do today, every day.
That's right. I mean, carbs have never been here. We've never had carbs as we do now. So, there is an essential amount of protein that's required for human health. There's an essential amount of fat in the diet mandated for human health. The human requirement for carbohydrates is none. Not 1 single gram of carbohydrates is required for human health at all.
Really?
That's right.
None. So, zero zilch.
That's right.
So you're saying, you can't have enough protein and fat? That too much is...
Oh, you can. You can have too much protein and too much fat, for sure. So, I mean, it's not a question of eating fat and protein all day long and you're going to be healthy. No, you won't, because ultimately if you eat too much protein, you'll convert that into high levels of carbohydrates. And protein, too, stimulates insulin. The only thing that doesn't happens to be fat. So, the diet that I'm talking about here is not one where we're eating, having a 16-ounce sirloin each day and 12 eggs. It's a diet that relegates the meat part of the dish, in other words, the chicken, the fish, or the grass-fed beef, as a side dish or even a garnish. It's mostly above-ground, low-carb vegetables, the colorful vegetables. This is the key to being healthy for the rest of your life, to stave off things like heart disease, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. When you eat carbs, you ultimately damage your body's ability to handle sugar and become a diabetic. So becoming a type 2 diabetic, by and large, is a dietary choice. The reason it's germane for our conversation today is quite simple. Because if you become a type 2 diabetic, you have doubled your risk for becoming an Alzheimer's patient. And again, there's no treatment for that. Interesting, isn't it?
It's fascinating. So we're talking about brain health, dementia, Alzheimer's, but we've also got, as you know, so many Americans today on all sorts of drugs for mood disorders and mental health issues, and we've got so many kids on all these, drugs for ADHD, et cetera, et cetera. What role does diet play and the carbs play with these issues?
I think it's fundamental. I mean, all those things that you mentioned, are predicated on the notion of inflammation. So the inflamed brain is a brain that doesn't work well, whether you're a fifth grader or you're 62 years old and starting to have cognitive issues. The other issue, and certainly our children are just pounding the carbs.
Mm-hmm.
We have been diagnosed in America now 6.5 million kids, and the scary part of that metric is that clearly 2/3 of them are now receiving brain-stimulating, brain-altering medications with the acceptance of their parents and their doctors. And it's ridiculous. 85% of all the ADHD medications on the planet are used right here in the U.S. of A. Does that mean we've got more of a problem? No. We're just diagnosing the heck out of these kids who can't sit still and have trouble focusing. And the quick fix in America is to load them up with amphetamines, basically, and that's what's going on. And we're supposed to be okay with that? That's business as usual? I'm very, very taken by that, especially as a practicing clinician watching what happens when we put kids on a low-carb, high-fat diet and oftentimes find that they're gluten-sensitive, taking them off foods that contain this protein called gluten found in wheat, barley, and rye that in some people is very, very inflammatory. Taking them off gluten is oftentimes a huge event. Giving them back the good fat so that they can build a healthy brain. Your brain is 60% fat. It's made from the fat that you eat. It doesn't come out of thin air. And, interestingly enough, about half of that fat is saturated fat, the dreaded saturated fat in meat and eggs that we were all told to avoid. That's craziness. 50% of human breast milk fat is saturated fat. How could it possibly be wrong for the developing brain?
I don't know, but some would certainly still argue differently, wouldn't they?
Well, again, people do tend to be down on what they're not up on.
Right. So what's the long-term effects on these children's brains that have been exposed to the amphetamines?
Well, I'm going to tell you a very scary answer to that question. The answer is we don't know. And that's worrisome. I mean, if I could list, a bunch of things that are common that we see happening, like the development of tics, appetite suppression, growth suppression, sleep disorders, depression, mood disorders, that's already in the PDR listed in terms of, the typical side effects that can occur with these medications. But long term, the longest term studies are 2 years on these drugs. No one's looked at it.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah,
we have several generations of kids on these drugs. We don't know what it's going to look like for them.
Isn't that just breathtaking?
Wow, it really is. And it's something that could be changed with diet.
Exactly. And, there's nothing really heroic about diet because it's not like, going and doing an open heart operation in the middle of the night. So that said, here we are talking about food, and it's kind of, maybe I hate to say boring, but no one gets really excited about it. It's the most powerful intervention in terms of health that exists.
Well, and I think there's so much resistance to changing one's diet, especially for children, because it means the entire family has to eat differently. And poor diet, what you and I would consider a poor diet, for most people, it's what they eat, it's what they're used to, it's what they like. And for the whole family to change, that's pretty drastic as opposed to giving Johnny a pill, which the medical doctor says is okay to do.
And that's true. So that's where, I'm doing my best to act as a doctor, which means teacher. It doesn't mean healer.
Well,
the point is, that's my mission. That's why I wrote Grain Brain. And then when people get this information and hear the kinds of statistics that you and I are talking about today and what's really going on, then they make the decision as to whether we do what's easy, eat whatever we want, and give Johnny the pill, or we put the entire family on the most healthful diet for human beings. and watch how their health will flourish.
Well, one of the reasons I was so excited to have you on the show is because I have so many alternative specialists on the show, because it is a lifestyle show and it's about, being healthy, and wealth is more than money, right? But you're a medical doctor. You, by definition, in this society, the society regards you in a higher position than a lot of the other type of professionals out there in health. I mean, that's just the reality. So you, as a medical doctor trained, saying this and speaking this and writing the book, I think carries so much more weight.
Well, I think you're right, and I have to tell you, I'm amazed, thrilled at the unexpected success of this book, now in its 11th printing.
Awesome.
Being published in 21 countries.
Fantastic.
You and I are having this conversation. Yesterday it was #1 on the New York Times Bestseller list.
I know. I saw that. Congratulations.
It's been on that list for 21 consecutive weeks, and I think it's because people are saying, holy Toledo, I didn't know this stuff. And my goodness, we're finally hearing the other side of this story that we were never told. That, yes, as a matter of fact, our lifestyle choices play a huge role in the destiny of our brain. And there you go.
And if you think about it, we don't have to be victim to something we don't understand or something we don't know. Your message is very empowering.
Yes, and I think that's the point. It's giving people the other side of the story. Then what they choose to do with it is going to be up to it's going to be up to them.
So we've talked about low carb, high fat diet. Let's talk about supplements. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about ways to boost brain power besides just diet. What else can we do?
Well, I think that these days, pretty much everybody in the field would agree that we're pretty deficient in vitamin D. And it turns out that vitamin D is not a vitamin. It's actually a hormone. It's built from cholesterol, of all things. And that said, I'm really aggressive with supplementing my patients with vitamin D. I think people need aggressive, good probiotics for really reasons that you and I just talked about in terms of the role of gut bacteria in modulating inflammation, for example. And that said, so we're really aggressive with that. I like alpha-lipoic acid. And I'm really thinking that DHA, a specific omega-3 called DHA, is really one of the most important nutritional supplements that people can take, because, frankly, the diet is not good enough anymore.
The vitamin D, is there a specific kind of vitamin D that you recommend?
Well, it's vitamin D3.
D3,
Any
okay.
brand will do.
Okay.
But that said, you might ask me a dosage. It's usually the next question, and there is no right dosage. What is right is the blood test that then shows you what the vitamin D level is, so that, Teresa, you might need 2,000 units of D a day, and I might need 10,000. You don't know until you look at your blood work. So we try to keep the vitamin D level in the middle to the upper part of the so-called normal curve.
Mm-hmm. And then we've got probiotics, of course, the coconut oil, which you're a big fan of.
Yeah, I think coconut oil is really great. It's a wonderful source of brain-healthy saturated fat. It is 90% saturated fat. Couldn't be better. And that said, I'm all over it. I mean, it's been very, very effective in our treatments for Alzheimer's, for example. You
also recommend resveratrol and turmeric.
Yes, and, the idea of using turmeric as an anti-inflammatory, that's brand new, too. That was only first described in the Vedic text some 3,000 years ago. So, again, this is really very, very important information. So, I think people need to be on some supplements. If our foods were ideal,
right,
then there wouldn't be any need. But, and if we were outside naked all day long,
getting in the vitamin
D, plenty of vitamin D, then we wouldn't need supplementation. But most of us don't live our lives outside naked all day long.
Right, right. One surprising thing that some people might be surprised about is coffee.
Yes, coffee turns out to be powerfully anti-inflammatory. And actually, several recent studies have been published demonstrating some really exciting things that coffee can do to actually protect the brain. There was one study looking at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. It was published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease in September of 2009. And the study demonstrated that in those individuals consuming 3 to 5 cups of coffee per day, their risk of developing Alzheimer's was 65% decreased.
That's huge.
Again, September 20th, 2009, in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. These are all on my website, which is drperlmutter.com. Everything's listed. You can search the site by term. You can put in coffee, and these articles will come up.
So that's obviously great news for Starbucks. Is there a specific kind of coffee that you recommend? I personally drink organic, very clean coffee. Yes, I think
organic is really very important because some coffee beans have been sprayed, and that becomes worrisome. Who knows what they've been sprayed with? But I think that, again, it's really important to understand that food modulates genetic expression. Your foods control the expression of your genes, and that is pretty exciting.
So basically what you're saying is that we're not victims to what our parents had in terms of diseases and illnesses. We can control, based on our food and our supplements, what kind of illnesses or diseases we suffer from in the future, correct?
Absolutely, and, aside from obviously trauma and things like that, and to some degree infectious diseases, but, we do note that people with better nutrition tend to be more resistant to infectious diseases. But that said, by and large, the things that people fear the most are the degenerative situations. The heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, and to an extent cancer as well. These are the things that are killing people these days, and these are all significantly related to our nutritional choices. It's not live your life come what may, eat the cereal out of the box with a couple teaspoons of sugar, and hope for the best. That's not based on science, and it's certainly not anything I've experienced.
And all those illnesses and diseases you just mentioned, it's epidemic.
It is, and doesn't need to be. So that said, again, that's why I'm out singing this song, because I really think it's time for people to wake up and, here we go, smell the coffee.
Right, exactly. What other changes can our listeners make today to help improve their health besides, the supplements and the diet? Anything else?
Well, I think that, you go on that diet and take specific supplements, but it'd be a good idea for people to get a sense as to their average blood sugar, and that's a simple test called hemoglobin A1C. In addition, I think people should all have their vitamin D levels checked. And if it's low, even though it's in the so-called normal range, I'm not really good enough with being in the normal range. I want people to have an optimal level of vitamin D. Keep it up around 70 or 80, and that might take 10,000 units a day. And so, some people might get the willies for that with that kind of recommendation. But again, the dosage doesn't matter. It's the blood level.
Okay, so the hemoglobin A1C test, the vitamin D, anything else?
Well, I think a good way to predict if you're on your way to diabetes, even while your blood sugar is still normal, is to get a test called fasting insulin, and that is this is a test that any doctor can do. It measures how aggressively your pancreas is having to work to keep up with, your carbohydrate load. So it's a really, really good test, and I recommend that. I'd like, in an ideal world, for the insulin level to be less than 2, but even 8 to 10, still not bad.
Less than 2, wow.
Yep, that's not unusual.
Okay, 8 to 10. So no sugars at all. Is there any healthy sweetener that you would recommend?
Well, the purpose of the sweeteners is really to give in to your sweet tooth, and I would prefer that people did not do that. Because the more that you cater to that, then the more likely you are to make mistakes. Because
sugar can act like a drug.
Well, sugar does act like a drug. Sugar stimulates the brain in exactly the same way, and in fact in the exact same areas as does cocaine. So the notion that it's sort of like cocaine in the brain, yeah, it is. Who knew?
Who knew? Right. So any type of sugar has the same effect, and the more you take it, the more it feeds that addiction, so to speak.
Exactly, and that's why the notion of supplementing with artificial sweeteners makes no sense. In our upcoming recipe book, the Grain Brain recipe book, that'll be out in September of 14, we do have a few recipes that have optional amounts of stevia in them if people are still not fully transitioned. But there's language in there that indicates, your goal needs to be stevia-free. Artificial sweetener usage is off the table, and definitely sugar-free, that's for sure.
And limiting fruits?
Fruit needs to be limited as well. Mm-hmm. Who knew?
Which goes against... Go
ahead, say it.
Goes against the grain. Sorry.
But the point is that, fruit contains something called fructose, which is fruit sugar. And, again, there's nothing wonderful about that. That is a very damaging sugar in terms of changing proteins in your body and doing what's called glycation. We mentioned that earlier, when sugar binds to protein. And that increases inflammation, which is the cornerstone of everything, Teresa, you don't want to get. So have an apple a day. Have a handful of blueberries. Have half a banana. Put it in your blender, whatever. But to be gorging on fruit, especially dried fruit, all day long is absolutely nonsense. It's what you don't want to do. We're trying to limit carbohydrates to about 60 to 80 grams a day, which is wonderful. But you have to understand, 60 to 80 grams a day, what does that mean? Let's say at breakfast, before your meal even arrives, you have a couple of 12-ounce glasses of orange juice. That's already 72 grams of carbohydrates. That's 18 teaspoons of pure white sugar before the croissant and whole grain cereal has even landed.
Your optimal day supply by 7 a.m.
Yeah, by your glass of juice.
Right. It's crazy.
It is crazy, but it's... I didn't make that up. That if you go to any nutrition almanac, you'll see that, and that's what's happening.
Well, Doctor, I so appreciate your information. You've got a great website, dr.david.com. We will link to your website on living-wealthy-radio.com and also have a recording of the show today. I love your background and the fact that you are the one out there with this message. There are many others, but you have so much credibility because of your background.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And come back to the show anytime. And good luck.
I'm happy to.
Congratulations again with #1 on the New York Times bestseller. That's a huge...
Thank you. I'm pleased.
Yes, very good.
All righty.
Now that you know what you can do to protect your brain, what changes can you make today to help prevent diseases such as Alzheimer's and dementia and memory loss? It can be easy as including more healthy fats in your diet and cutting carbohydrates and cutting down on the sugar. Dr. Perlmutter has given us some great advice today about what to eat for a healthier brain. You can go to his website, Dr. Perlmutter, Dr. Perlmutter.com, and also livingwealthyradio.com. You've been listening to Living Wealthy Radio on Talk 1370 and streaming live at talk1370.com. I'm Teresa Kuhn, and I hope you'll join me again next week as I show you ways to live wealthier. Resources are available for you on our website at livingwealthyradio.com.